David Marshall pulled his coat tighter around himself as he stepped out of the tall glass building, his breath visible in the cold night air. The business meeting had run late, and now, the streets of downtown New York were almost deserted, save for the distant hum of the city that never truly slept. The rain had started to fall heavily, the icy droplets quickly soaking his shoes as he walked briskly toward his car. He was tired, his mind preoccupied with deals, deadlines, and the exhausting pressure that came with being one of the city's wealthiest businessmen. Just as David reached the curb, something caught his eye. Through the veil of rain, a figure appeared. Small, hunched over, standing near a lamppost a few feet away. At first glance, it seemed like just another homeless person seeking shelter from the storm. But there was something different. Something about the way she stood, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, shivering as the rain pounded down mercilessly. Then, he noticed the unmistakable swell of her belly. She was pregnant. Her clothes, soaked through, clung to her frail body. She had no shoes. David slowed his pace, his heart inexplicably pulling him toward her. "Hey!" he called out, his voice barely rising above the sound of the rain. The woman didn't look up. She seemed to shrink even more, as if trying to disappear into the night. David hesitated for a moment. He was a man of logic, of careful decisions, but something about this felt different. Against his better judgment, he took a step toward her, then another, until he was standing just a few feet away. "Are you okay?" he asked, softer this time. The woman flinched slightly, her shoulders trembling. Slowly, she lifted her head, and their eyes met. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, and her eyes, those eyes, held a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and something else. Something that made his stomach twist. Familiarity. "I'm fine," she whispered, though the crack in her voice betrayed the lie. She glanced away quickly, as if ashamed to be seen in such a state. David felt a strange pull in his chest. She was young, too young to be out here like this. And pregnant? Alone in the middle of a storm? He couldn't just leave her here. His mind flashed to the many stories he'd read of tragedies in the streets, women forgotten by society, forced into desperation. He couldn't shake the feeling that walking away would haunt him forever. "Look," David said, his tone softening, "you can't stay out here. You'll freeze." She shook her head weakly. "I'll be fine. I don't need help." But she was shivering, her thin arms barely able to hold herself upright. He could see the pain etched in her face, a quiet suffering that broke through her attempt to remain strong. His own heart, which had been hardened by years of business, negotiations, and losses, stirred with a kind of empathy he hadn't felt in a long time. "I have a place nearby," David continued, keeping his distance to avoid overwhelming her. "You can warm up, get dry, just until the rain stops." The woman looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to decide whether he was someone she could trust. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. It was the smallest of movements, but enough for David to step closer, offering his hand. She hesitated again before placing her trembling fingers in his. Her skin was ice cold, and he could feel how frail she was. Slowly, he led her toward his car, opening the passenger door and helping her in. She sank into the seat, her entire body shaking as the warmth of the car's interior began to envelop her. David slid into the driver's seat, glancing at her again. She stared out the window, watching the rain streak across the glass, her silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. He could see her trying to keep her guard up, but the exhaustion was clear. They drove in silence for several minutes, the sound of the rain against the windshield the only noise between them. David's mind raced. Who was she? How did she end up like this? And why did she seem familiar? The questions gnawed at him, but he didn't want to push her. Not yet. Within 15 minutes, they arrived at his mansion, a sprawling estate that seemed out of place amidst the dreary night. He parked in front of the grand entrance, and for a brief moment, he wondered if bringing a stranger into his home was a mistake. But then he looked at her again, and the doubt faded. He led her inside, where warmth and light greeted them, a stark contrast to the cold, wet darkness outside. The woman stood awkwardly near the entrance, her eyes scanning the luxurious surroundings, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden change of environment. "I'll get you some dry clothes," David said, heading upstairs without waiting for a response. He returned a few minutes later with a towel and some comfortable clothes, things that once belonged to a woman he had loved, a memory he wasn't ready to confront tonight. He handed them to her, careful not to meet her eyes this time. "There's a bathroom down the hall if you want to change," he said quietly. She nodded, clutching the clothes to her chest as she made her way down the hall. David watched her disappear behind the door, the silence of the house settling in once again. He let out a long breath, rubbing his hands over his face. What had he just done? Who was she? And why did something about her seem to tug at the edges of his memory, like a thread waiting to unravel? As the rain continued to pour outside, David stood alone in the hallway, his mind swirling with questions. David paced the living room, listening to the sound of water running in the bathroom down the hall. He felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. This was entirely unlike him, inviting a stranger, a vulnerable woman, into his home. He had always lived by strict rules, control, order, and distance. But now, none of that seemed to matter. The rain continued to beat against the windows, creating a steady rhythm that mirrored his restless thoughts. He had no idea what her story was, but there was a palpable sadness in her eyes that lingered with him. As much as he tried to rationalize the situation, something deep within him had shifted when he saw her standing alone in the rain. It wasn't just empathy. It was a connection he couldn't quite explain. He was startled out of his thoughts when the woman emerged from the hallway, now dressed in the dry clothes he had given her. They were a little too big for her, the sleeves of the sweatshirt covering her hands, but she looked more comfortable, less fragile. She held the towel in her hand, still wringing the ends nervously as she hesitated at the edge of the room. David gestured for her to sit on the couch. "Please, make yourself comfortable." She moved slowly, her eyes scanning the room as if she was still unsure if she belonged there. Her movements were cautious, deliberate, like someone who had learned not to trust the kindness of others. When she finally sat down, she perched on the edge of the seat, ready to flee if she needed to. David sat in the armchair across from her, giving her space. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick with unasked questions. He didn't want to push her, but he also knew they couldn't sit in silence forever. "My name is David," he said finally, trying to break the tension. "I don't mean to intrude, but do you want to talk about what happened? How you ended up out there in the rain?" She glanced at him, her eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. For a moment, David thought she might retreat back into herself, that maybe he had pushed too soon. But then she exhaled softly, as if finally letting go of the weight she'd been carrying alone. "My name is Sarah," she began, her voice low and hesitant. She looked down at her hands, twisting the fabric of the towel in her lap. "I didn't plan on being here, like this." David nodded, urging her to continue without pressing too hard. He could see how difficult this was for her, how every word seemed to come with a struggle. She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "I was with someone I thought cared about me. But when I told him I was pregnant, everything changed. He wanted nothing to do with the baby, nothing to do with me." Her voice cracked slightly, and she quickly looked away, blinking back tears. David's chest tightened at the raw vulnerability in her words. He knew all too well the feeling of abandonment, though in his case, it had been different. Still, it was an ache that never fully healed. "I tried to make it work on my own," Sarah continued, her voice steadier now. "But things got complicated. I couldn't afford rent. My job let me go when they found out I was pregnant. And soon, I had nowhere to go. I've been on the streets for a few weeks now." David felt a surge of anger on her behalf. The injustice of it all. The fact that a woman could be cast aside so easily, left to fend for herself in a world that showed her no mercy. He leaned forward slightly, trying to offer some comfort without overwhelming her. "I'm so sorry," he said softly. "You didn't deserve that. No one does." Sarah's gaze shifted back to him, her expression guarded but grateful for his words. "I've been trying to stay strong," she whispered, "for the baby, but it's been hard." David's eyes instinctively moved to her stomach, and a wave of protectiveness surged through him. He had no idea why, but the thought of her being alone, vulnerable and pregnant, stirred something deep within him. It was more than just a desire to help, it was a need, a responsibility he couldn't ignore. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," David said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "You can stay here for as long as you need. I'll help you." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, as if she couldn't quite believe what he was offering. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me." David hesitated. It was a fair question. Why was he doing this? The logical part of his mind screamed that this was reckless, that he didn't know anything about this woman or her past. But then there was the other part of him, the part that had been stirred awake the moment he saw her in the rain. The part that knew this was the right thing to do, even if he couldn't fully explain why. "I don't know," he admitted quietly, "but I know what it feels like to lose someone, to feel alone, and I don't want that for you." Sarah's eyes softened, and for the first time since he'd met her, her shoulders seemed to relax slightly. She still didn't fully trust him. He could see that. But there was a flicker of hope there, a tiny flame that hadn't been extinguished yet. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. David nodded, offering her a small smile. "You're safe here." For the first time in what felt like hours, the tension in the room began to ease. Sarah sank back into the couch, finally allowing herself a moment of rest. David stood up quietly, heading to the kitchen to make some tea. He needed time to think, to process what had just happened. As he filled the kettle with water, his mind raced. He had offered her a place to stay, but what now? What was his next step? And why did he feel so deeply compelled to protect her? There were still so many unanswered questions, but one thing was clear. He couldn't walk away from this. When he returned to the living room with 2 steaming mugs, Sarah was staring out the window, her eyes distant, lost in thought. He handed her a mug, and she accepted it gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warmth. "Thank you," she said again, her voice soft but sincere. "For everything." David sat down across from her, his mind still spinning with the gravity of what had just unfolded. He had a feeling that this was only the beginning. There was more to her story. He could feel it. And as the rain continued to fall outside, he couldn't shake the growing sense that their lives had just become irrevocably intertwined. The air inside the mansion was still, carrying a weight that neither David nor Sarah could shake off. The quietness of the morning felt almost unnatural, especially after the intensity of the night before. David couldn't get Sarah's story out of his mind. The desperation in her voice, the fear etched in her expression. And yet, despite everything, there was something about her he couldn't fully trust. Not yet. Not until he understood the whole truth. Sarah sat across from him at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she barely touched. She looked better, cleaner, warmer, but the anxiety that radiated from her was unmistakable. David watched her carefully, his mind racing with thoughts of what she had revealed. The story of a man who had abandoned her after she became pregnant, the dangerous people who had started following her. None of it sat right with him. It felt like there was a piece missing, something she wasn't saying. David decided to break the silence, knowing they couldn't avoid the conversation much longer. "Sarah," he began, keeping his tone gentle, "there's something about all of this that doesn't add up." She flinched slightly, but didn't look away. "What do you mean?" "I believe you about the danger," David said carefully, "but there's something you're not telling me, isn't there?" For a moment, her face remained impassive, like a wall she perfected over time. But then, as if a dam had cracked, she sighed heavily and lowered her gaze. "You're right," she admitted. "There's more to it. I didn't want to tell you everything because I wasn't sure you'd believe me." David leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Try me." Sarah hesitated, gripping the cup tighter, as if drawing strength from it. "The man I was with, he didn't just leave me. He disappeared. Completely. He didn't just abandon me. He vanished, without a trace." David's eyebrows furrowed. "Vanished? What do you mean?" "I mean, one day he was there, the next, he was gone," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I tried to find him. I tried everything, but there was nothing. It was like he never existed. And that's when the people started following me, watching me. I know it sounds crazy, but it doesn't sound crazy, David interrupted, his voice firm. It sounds deliberate. Her eyes widened in surprise. Deliberate? Think about it, David said, his mind working quickly. If he disappeared like that, it wasn't by accident. Someone made him disappear. And if they're watching you, there's something much bigger going on. Sarah's face paled, and for the first time, David saw the full extent of her fear. She had been running from something far more dangerous than just an ex-lover. He could feel the weight of the situation sinking deeper into his chest. He had thought he was just helping a woman in need, but now it was clear that Sarah was caught in something far beyond her control. I don't know what they want, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. But I'm scared, David. I'm scared they'll come for me, or worse, for the baby. David's jaw clenched, a surge of protectiveness washing over him. He didn't know why, but the thought of something happening to her, or to the child she carried, filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in years. He had lost someone before, and the thought of losing anyone else, especially now, was unbearable. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice low but resolute. Not until we figure this out. I won't let anything happen to you. Sarah looked at him with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. David opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. He didn't fully understand it himself. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away from this. There was something about Sarah, something about her story that pulled at the deepest part of him. And it wasn't just pity or empathy, it was something more. I don't know, he finally admitted, his voice softer now, but I do know that I can't let you face this alone. For a moment, they sat in silence, the unspoken tension between them thick in the air. David's mind raced with possibilities, with questions he didn't yet have answers to. But one thing was clear. Whoever was after Sarah wasn't going to stop. And if he was going to protect her, he needed to understand what he was up against. Do you have any idea who these people are? David asked, trying to piece together the puzzle. Sarah shook her head. I've only seen them from a distance. They never get too close. I thought I could lose them by moving around, but no matter where I go, they always find me. David's heart sank. This was worse than he thought. Whoever was after her had resources, and they weren't going to let her slip away easily. He stood up, pacing the room as he tried to formulate a plan. We need to be smart about this, he muttered, mostly to himself. They're watching you, but they don't know I'm involved yet. We can use that to our advantage. Sarah watched him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. What do you mean? David stopped pacing and looked at her directly. We need to find out who they are, what they want. And to do that, we need to draw them out. But on our terms, not theirs. Sarah's face tightened with fear. You mean, use me as bait? No, David said quickly. Not like that. I wouldn't put you in harm's way. But we can't keep running blind. We need answers, and the only way to get them is to make them slip up. Sarah's breathing quickened, the fear evident in her eyes. David, I'm not sure I can do this. You're not doing it alone, he said firmly. I'll be with you every step of the way. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. David's resolve was unwavering. He had made up his mind. He was going to protect her, no matter what it took. And as much as the thought of confronting whoever was after her terrified him, he knew there was no other option. Okay, Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Okay. David nodded, feeling the weight of their agreement settle between them. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way. As they sat there, the morning sun filtering through the windows, David couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something big, something that could change everything. And though he couldn't explain it, he knew deep down that Sarah's past was somehow tied to his own. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but there were still too many missing. As the day stretched on, David made a silent vow to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. That night, the house was cloaked in an eerie stillness. David sat alone in his study, the flicker of the fireplace casting long shadows across the room. He had tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't let him. Too many thoughts swirled. Sarah's story, the looming danger, the mystery of who was after her. But underneath it all, something even more personal gnawed at him, something he had buried for years. He ran a hand through his hair, staring into the fire as memories he had tried to forget resurfaced with a vengeance. Sarah wasn't the only one running from the past. David had his own ghost to face. And tonight, they were closer than ever. His thoughts drifted to the child he had lost. The ache hit him hard, like it always did when he allowed himself to think about it. It had been years, but the pain never really went away. It was just buried, deep under layers of success, wealth, and distractions. But now, with Sarah's presence, the wound was reopening, and he couldn't stop it. David had been in love once, deeply, foolishly in love with a woman named Elise. She was everything to him, and when they found out she was pregnant, he had been ready to start a new life, a family. But then, everything fell apart. Elise had complications during the pregnancy, and when the day came, she didn't survive. Neither did the baby, or at least that's what they told him. He never saw the child. They said it was for the best, that the baby had passed shortly after birth. He never questioned it. The grief consumed him so completely that he couldn't even bring himself to ask for more details. He had lost them both in the blink of an eye, and in that moment, his life had changed forever. For years, David had carried that guilt, that gnawing emptiness, believing that if he had just done something differently, they might still be alive. He had thrown himself into his work, building an empire to fill the void, but no amount of money or success could replace what he had lost. And now, with Sarah's baby on the way, the memories of his own child flooded back, more vivid than ever. It was the cruelest twist of fate. Just when he thought he had finally put it all behind him, David stood, pacing the room, trying to shake the memories. But the more he fought them, the more they consumed him. Elise's face, the sound of her laughter, the plans they had made, and then the cold, sterile hospital room, the news that shattered his world. He had never really recovered from it. He never allowed himself to. And now here was Sarah, pregnant and alone, her life spiraling out of control just like Elise's had. He couldn't help but feel like the universe was playing some twisted game with him. Was he meant to save Sarah because he couldn't save Elise? Was this some cruel second chance he didn't ask for? As the fire crackled softly in the background, David leaned against the window, staring out at the darkened city below. The rain had returned, falling softly against the glass. It was almost peaceful, in a way, but inside, his mind was anything but. The quiet sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept either. She wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said softly, glancing at the papers spread across his desk. David shook his head. "You're not interrupting. I couldn't sleep." "Me neither," she admitted, stepping hesitantly into the room. "Too much on my mind." She stood awkwardly by the door, as if unsure whether she was welcome. David gestured to the chair by the fire, inviting her to sit. Sarah moved cautiously, lowering herself into the chair and curling her legs beneath her. The firelight illuminated her face, highlighting the deep circles under her eyes. She looked exhausted, emotionally, physically, in every possible way. "I've been thinking about everything you told me," David said, sitting across from her. "About the people who are after you. About your situation." Sarah nodded, but didn't speak. She looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers nervously in her lap. "I know this is hard," David continued, his voice steady. "But I need to know everything, Sarah. I need to understand what we're up against." Her eyes flickered with fear, but she nodded. "I told you the truth," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But there's more to it. I didn't tell you everything, because it's too painful." David's stomach tightened. He had expected as much. "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes welling with tears she was clearly fighting to hold back. "The father of my baby. He wasn't just some random guy. I loved him. We were together for a long time, and I thought we were going to have a family together. But when I told him I was pregnant, he changed. He got distant, cold." David leaned forward, sensing that she was finally opening up, revealing the parts of the story she had hidden before. He started getting involved with people I didn't know, Sarah continued, her voice trembling. People who were dangerous. I think he owed them money or favors, something. I never got the full story, but I knew they were bad news. And when I told him about the baby, he panicked, said I needed to leave, that it wasn't safe anymore. David's heart clenched as he listened. This wasn't just a story of abandonment. It was a story of fear, of someone running from a life that had spiraled out of control. And then, one night, he just disappeared, Sarah whispered, wiping at her eyes. I tried to find him, but there was nothing, no trace of him anywhere. And that's when they started coming after me. I don't even know what they want. Maybe they think I know something, or maybe they just want me gone. But I'm scared, David. I'm scared for me and for the baby. Her voice cracked, and she quickly covered her face with her hands, trying to stifle the sobs that were building inside her. David felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her, gently pulling her hands away from her face. Sarah, he said quietly, you're not alone in this anymore. I promise you, I'm going to help you. She looked up at him, her tear-streaked face full of uncertainty. Why? She whispered. Why are you doing this? I'm just some girl. Why do you care? David didn't have a clear answer. He could feel the unspoken connection between them, but he couldn't put it into words. All he knew was that he couldn't let her face this alone. He had failed to save the woman he once loved. He wasn't going to make that mistake again. Because I've lost people too, David said softly. And I know what it feels like to think there's no one left. For a long moment, they sat there in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Sarah's tears slowly dried, and for the first time, she seemed to believe him. The ghosts of their pasts hovered in the room, unspoken but undeniable. And as the night wore on, David realized that the road ahead was far more dangerous than he had anticipated. But he was ready to face it, because something told him that Sarah's story was only just beginning. Days passed in uneasy silence. The mansion became a safe haven for Sarah, but the tension was always there, like a low hum beneath the surface. David had hired private security, and although no one had shown up at the gates, the feeling of being watched never quite left them. Sarah's anxiety was palpable, and every time she glanced out the windows or flinched at the sound of footsteps, David's determination to protect her deepened. One afternoon, Sarah was in the living room, absent-mindedly flipping through an old magazine when the doorbell rang. The sudden sound made her jump. David, who was in his office down the hall, appeared almost immediately, his expression tense. Neither of them had been expecting visitors. I'll get it, he said, glancing at her reassuringly. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched him disappear toward the front door. She knew it was probably nothing, but fear had a way of seeping into everything lately. David pulled open the door cautiously, only to be met with a familiar face. It was a woman, petite, with dark hair tied back and a warm smile that quickly faded as she glanced over David's shoulder. David, she greeted him, her voice laced with surprise. It's been a while. David frowned. Megan? What are you doing here? I'm here to check on Sarah, Megan said, her eyes scanning the hallway behind him. She's been through a lot, and I was worried. I didn't know she was with you. David's confusion deepened. He turned to glance back at Sarah, who had stepped into the hallway, watching the interaction from a distance. Megan's expression softened when she saw her. Sarah, thank God you're okay, Megan said, stepping past David and walking toward her friend. I've been so worried about you. Sarah's eyes widened, and for a moment, she seemed frozen. Megan, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. David watched the two women embrace, his mind racing. Sarah had never mentioned a friend named Megan, but then again, there were plenty of details she had withheld. The uneasiness settled deeper in his chest. After a moment, the women pulled apart, and Megan turned to David. Thank you for taking care of her, she said sincerely. I didn't know where she was after everything that happened. David nodded slowly. She's safe here. But what exactly did happen? Megan's face darkened slightly, and she glanced at Sarah, as if unsure how much to say. I think that's something Sarah should tell you. Sarah swallowed hard, her eyes avoiding David's. It was clear she wasn't ready to revisit those memories, but the tension in the room was undeniable. Something was coming to the surface, whether Sarah wanted it to or not. I didn't want to get you involved, Megan, Sarah said, her voice shaking. It's dangerous. I didn't know what else to do. Megan sighed, stepping closer. You don't have to go through this alone. I'm here, and I want to help. Whatever it is, we can figure it out. David watched the interaction, a feeling of dread creeping into his chest. This wasn't just about Sarah's past or the people chasing her. There was something more, something that connected them all, and it was about to unravel. The conversation shifted quickly as Megan started asking questions about how Sarah had been coping, but David's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. And then it happened. A single sentence that turned his entire world upside down. You know, Megan said casually, I always thought it was strange how that clinic handled everything back then. I still don't understand why they... Wait. David's voice cut through the room, sharp and commanding. He turned to Megan, his heart suddenly racing. What clinic? Megan blinked, surprised by his sudden change in tone. The clinic where Sarah had her first checkups. The one she went to after, she trailed off, her gaze flicking to Sarah, whose face had gone pale. David stepped closer, his pulse hammering in his ears. What are you talking about? Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear. Her eyes met David's for a brief moment, and in that instant, he saw the fear. The same fear she had been hiding since the day she showed up on his doorstep. The clinic, she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. The one I was sent to after the baby. David's breath caught in his throat. His mind flashed back to his own past, to the hospital where Elise had died, to the child he had lost. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was too horrifying to comprehend. Sarah, David said, his voice shaking now, what clinic are you talking about? Sarah's lips trembled. The clinic where they told me the baby was dead. The words hit him like a freight train. His legs felt weak, and he had to grip the back of a chair to steady himself. What did you say? Megan, sensing the sudden shift, glanced between the two of them, confused. David, what's going on? He didn't answer. His eyes were locked on Sarah's, searching for confirmation of the horrible truth that was slowly dawning on him. The clinic where they said the baby didn't survive, Sarah repeated, her voice barely audible. But I never saw the body. They just told me. David's mind was spinning. The clinic, the baby, the loss he had endured, the hole in his life that had never been filled. Could it be? Could the child he had believed was dead be alive? He staggered back, the shock too much to process all at once. His chest tightened, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Memories of Elise flooded his mind, her laughter, her excitement about the baby, and then the heartbreak, the emptiness that had consumed him for years. What was the clinic called? David demanded, his voice strained. Sarah hesitated, her eyes filled with regret. It was the Winston Clinic, on the east side. David's blood ran cold. That name. It was the same clinic where Elise had been taken, the same place where they had told him his baby had died. The room spun, and David had to force himself to breathe. Could it really be possible? Could his child still be alive? And if so, was Sarah connected to all of it? Megan stepped forward, her concern evident. David, are you okay? What's going on? David's mind raced as the enormity of the situation hit him. Everything he had believed for years, his grief, his loss, the future he had mourned, had been built on a lie. And Sarah, standing in front of him, might be the key to unraveling that lie. We need to find out the truth, David said, his voice hollow. We need to find out what really happened at that clinic. The room fell into a heavy silence as the implications of his words settled over them all. The air was thick with tension as David stood by the window, staring out at the rain-soaked city. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, memories colliding with the present, emotions he thought he had buried surging back with a vengeance. The clinic, the child, Elise. Could it all be connected? Could the son he thought he lost still be out there, Alive? Behind him, Sarah sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Megan stood nearby, watching both of them with a mix of confusion and concern. No one spoke. The weight of what had just been revealed seemed too heavy for words. David finally turned away from the window, his eyes locking onto Sarah's. "We need answers," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And we need them now." Sarah's face was pale, her expression torn between fear and guilt. "I don't know what to tell you, David," she whispered. "I didn't know any of this about you, about the clinic. I thought my baby was gone." David's stomach churned at the mention of the baby. His mind was spinning, trying to connect the dots, but nothing made sense yet. How could their lives have crossed in such a way? How could both of them have ended up at the same clinic, under the same circumstances, without knowing it? Megan cleared her throat, stepping forward. "If what you're saying is true, then the clinic was involved in something much bigger than we ever realized. But why? Why would they lie about something like this?" David shook his head, his frustration growing. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." He pulled out his phone and quickly dialed a number, pacing the room as he waited for the call to connect. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Mr. Marshall, it's been a while." "Henry," David said, his tone clipped, "I need your help with something. I need to dig into some records. Specifically, from the Winston Clinic." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The Winston Clinic? That place has been shut down for years." "I know," David replied, running a hand through his hair, "but I need information about what happened there. From about 7 years ago. Anything you can find on their practices, their staff, any irregularities." Henry's voice took on a more serious tone. "I'll look into it, but from what I remember, that clinic had a lot of shady rumors around it. You sure you want to go down this road?" David glanced at Sarah, then back out the window. "I don't have a choice." "All right, give me some time. I'll get back to you." David hung up the phone and turned back to the room. Megan was pacing now, her arms crossed, while Sarah sat still, staring at the floor. The gravity of what they were facing was starting to sink in, and no one knew what to say. Finally, Megan broke the silence. "Do you really think this could be true? That your child, both of your children, could still be out there?" David clenched his fists, the thought of it almost too overwhelming to consider. "I don't know, but if there's even a chance, I have to find out." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "David, I don't know how to help. I don't even know if I can help. I've been so lost. I never thought there was any hope." David's heart clenched. He knelt in front of her, gently taking her hands in his. "Sarah, this is more than just your story now. It's our story. Whatever happened at that clinic, we're both a part of it, and we need to find out the truth, for both of us." She nodded, swallowing hard. "I just don't want you to get hurt because of me." "I'm already in this," David replied, his voice soft but resolute. "We both are, and I'm not giving up until we know the truth." Megan, watching the interaction, took a deep breath. If the clinic was involved in something illegal, like trafficking or selling babies, then we're dealing with dangerous people. People who will go to great lengths to keep their secrets hidden. David stood, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll have to be smart about it. But I won't let them get away with this. Not after everything they've taken." The room fell into silence again as they each grappled with the enormity of what lay ahead. The idea that their children could be alive was almost too much to process. But with that sliver of hope came a deep, gnawing fear. What if it wasn't true? What if they were chasing ghosts? Or worse, what if they uncovered something they weren't prepared to face? Later that evening, Sarah sat alone in the guest bedroom, staring out the window at the darkened sky. The rain had stopped, but the heaviness in the air remained. She couldn't stop thinking about David, about the way his face had changed when he realized the connection between them. He had lost so much, just like she had. And now, they were both standing on the edge of something that could change everything. A soft knock on the door broke through her thoughts. She turned to see Megan standing in the doorway, her expression somber. "Hey," Megan said quietly, stepping into the room, "how are you holding up?" Sarah shrugged, her voice barely audible. "I don't even know anymore." Megan sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes filled with concern. "I've known you for years, Sarah, and I've seen you go through some tough times. But this is something else entirely." "I don't know how to feel," Sarah admitted, her voice trembling. "Part of me wants to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything they told me was a lie. But the other part of me is terrified that I'm setting myself up for more heartbreak." Megan reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I get it, but whatever happens, you're not alone in this. David's in it with you now, and so am I." Sarah nodded, wiping at her eyes. "I just don't want to hurt him." "You're not going to hurt him," Megan said firmly. "He's already in this with you, Sarah, and he's stronger than you think." A heavy silence settled over the room. Sarah knew Megan was right. David had already risked so much to help her, and now they were bound together by the secrets of their pasts. But that didn't make the fear go away. "What if we're wrong?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if there's no child? What if it's all been a lie?" Megan's expression softened. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever the truth is, we'll handle it." Sarah looked at her friend, grateful for her support, but still unable to shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something far darker than they expected. Something that could destroy them all. Hours later, David sat in his office, his eyes scanning the old files he had dug up from his own records. The Winston Clinic had been a small, unremarkable place, known for its discreet services. But after Elise's death, rumors had started to swirl, whispers about illegal adoptions, baby trafficking, and forged death certificates. David had dismissed them at the time, too deep in his grief to care. But now those rumors felt all too real. His phone buzzed on the desk, jolting him from his thoughts. He quickly answered, his heart racing. "David, it's Henry," the voice on the other end said. "I found something." David's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "There are records, David. Records of babies that were marked as deceased, but were actually sent to different families. There's a trail, but it's buried deep. The Winston Clinic was involved in some serious corruption, and it looks like your case was one of them." David's breath caught in his throat. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying your child may still be alive, David, but there's more. This wasn't just a one-off case. They did this to multiple families." David's grip tightened on the phone. "And Sarah's child?" "I'm still digging, but it's possible. Very possible." David's heart pounded in his chest. The truth was finally starting to emerge, and with it, the realization that everything they had believed, all the loss, the pain, had been built on a lie. David's hand tightened around the phone as Henry's words echoed in his mind. His child, alive. Sarah's baby, possibly alive too. The reality of it was staggering, almost too much to comprehend. For years, David had grieved for a life lost, carrying the weight of that loss like an anchor. And now, with a few sentences, everything had changed. "David?" Henry's voice broke through his stunned silence. "Are you still there?" "I'm here," David managed to say, his voice hoarse. "You're sure about this? About the clinic?" "As sure as I can be, given the records," Henry replied. "It's all there, buried deep, but it paints a clear picture. The Winston Clinic was involved in a black market baby adoption ring. They faked deaths, told families their children were gone, and then sold those babies to desperate couples looking to adopt. It's sick, David. They preyed on grieving families." David's stomach churned with disgust. The anger that had simmered inside him for years flared into a white-hot rage. How could they have done this? To him, to Sarah, to all those families? He had spent years thinking his child was dead. The loss had shaped his entire life. And now, to find out it had all been a lie. "I want to know everything," David said through clenched teeth. "Names, records, every person involved." Henry hesitated. "It won't be easy. This kind of thing doesn't just happen without protection. Whoever ran this operation had powerful people backing them. But I'll keep digging. In the meantime, you need to be careful, David. If they find out you're investigating, they won't hesitate to come after you." Or Sarah. David's gaze shifted to the door of his office, where just beyond it, Sarah was sitting, waiting. She had been through enough. She didn't deserve to be pulled even deeper into this nightmare. But there was no avoiding it now. Their lives were entwined by a shared tragedy, and the only way out was through. "Thanks, Henry," David said, his voice low. "Keep me updated." He hung up and stood in silence for a moment, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside him. There was no time for anger or grief right now. He needed to act. And the first step was telling Sarah the truth. David found her sitting in the living room, the soft glow of a lamp casting shadows on her face. She looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his, and he could see the fear there. She knew something had shifted. "David," she asked, her voice trembling, "what did you find out?" He sat down across from her, his mind still reeling from the weight of what he was about to say. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking. "The clinic," he began slowly, "was part of something bigger. They didn't just handle normal adoptions. They were involved in a scheme, an illegal operation where they told parents their babies had died, but in reality, they were selling those babies to other families." Sarah's face went pale, her breath hitching as the words sunk in. "What? That can't be." "I have proof," David interrupted gently. "The records. Everything points to it. Your baby, my baby, they were part of this. We were both lied to, Sarah." For a moment, she sat in stunned silence, her hands gripping the armrests of the chair. Then, as if the reality of it hit all at once, her body began to tremble. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, that can't be true. I saw the doctor. They told me. They lied to you," David said firmly, leaning forward. "Just like they lied to me. They faked the deaths, Sarah. There's a chance your child is still out there, alive." Tears welled in her eyes, her chest heaving as she struggled to process the information. "But how could they do that? How could they take our babies and sell them?" "It's evil," David finished for her, his voice bitter. "It's evil, and we're going to bring it to light. But first, we need to find out where they are. We need to find them." Sarah wiped at her eyes, nodding shakily. "But where do we start? How do we even begin to look for them?" David's mind raced through the possibilities. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The people who ran this operation had covered their tracks for years, but they weren't invincible, and now that he knew what he was up against, he wouldn't stop until he found the truth. "We start with the clinic," David said decisively. "We need to go back to where it all began. There might be something there. Records, people who worked there, anything that can give us a lead." Sarah swallowed hard, her hands trembling in her lap. "And what if we find out? What if they really are gone?" David reached across the small table between them, taking her hands in his. "Then we face it together," he said softly. "But we can't stop now. We have to know." The fear in Sarah's eyes was palpable, but she nodded, squeezing his hands in silent agreement. David stood, pulling out his phone and dialing another number. They would need help. Someone who could dig deeper than Henry, someone with connections. "Who are you calling?" Sarah asked, her voice still shaky. "Someone who knows how to find people," David replied grimly. The next day, they met with an investigator David had worked with in the past, a man named Richard, who had a reputation for finding answers when no one else could. He was older, grizzled, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. David explained the situation as they sat in a small, dimly lit office on the outskirts of the city. Richard listened carefully, taking notes, his expression unreadable. When David finished, Richard leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his desk. "You're asking for a lot," Richard said slowly. "The Winston Clinic was shut down years ago, and most of the people involved went underground. But I can find them. It'll take time, though, and it won't be cheap." "Money's not an issue," David replied, his voice firm. "Just find them." Richard nodded, but his eyes flicked to Sarah. "And you're sure you're ready for this? Once I start digging, there's no going back. You'll be stirring up a hornet's nest." Sarah hesitated, fear flashing in her eyes, but then she straightened her shoulders. "I need to know what happened to my baby. I'll do whatever it takes." Richard studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right, I'll start with the clinic records and see where that leads. But be careful. If these people find out you're investigating, they won't hesitate to come after you." David's jaw tightened. Let them try. As they left Richard's office, the weight of the situation settled over them. David could feel the tension in the air, the sense that they were getting closer to the truth, but also closer to something dangerous. They had started down a path they couldn't turn back from, and now, it was only a matter of time before they found the answers they were looking for, whether they were ready for them or not. Later that night, back at the mansion, David sat in his study, staring at the fire as it flickered in the hearth. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something big, something that would change everything. But with that feeling came a deep sense of unease. His thoughts drifted back to Elise, to the life they had planned together before it had been ripped away. Now, all these years later, he was on the cusp of finding the child he had lost. But at what cost? Would this search bring them peace, or would it tear open wounds that had never fully healed? The quiet creak of the door pulled him from his thoughts. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "I can't sleep," she admitted, stepping into the room. David nodded, gesturing for her to sit by the fire. She moved to the chair opposite him, curling up as the warmth of the flames bathed her in soft light. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The weight of what they were about to face hung heavily between them, unspoken but undeniable. "We're going to find them," David said quietly, breaking the silence. "No matter what it takes." Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of both fear and hope. "And if we don't?" David's gaze hardened. "We will." The rain had returned, tapping steadily against the mansion's windows as the hours crept by. David sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched cup of coffee. His mind was miles away, replaying every word from Henry's call and Richard's promises to uncover the truth about the clinic. Time felt like it was slipping through his fingers, and with each passing moment, the urgency to find their children grew more intense. Across from him, Sarah sat in silence, picking at the edge of her sleeve, her eyes distant. Since leaving Richard's office, she had barely spoken. David knew she was struggling with the same questions he was. What if it's too late? What if we find nothing? But there was something else in her expression, something darker. Guilt. David leaned forward, breaking the quiet. "What's on your mind?" Sarah glanced up at him, startled by the sudden question. "I'm just trying to process everything," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the rain. But David could see there was more to it. "Sarah, you've been quiet ever since we spoke to Richard. If there's something you need to say, you can tell me." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the mug in front of her. For a long moment, it seemed like she was going to retreat, keep the walls up. But then she exhaled shakily, her voice breaking. "I've been keeping something from you, David." His heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Sarah bit her lip, her eyes filled with regret. "It's about the baby, about what happened after the clinic." David's pulse quickened. He had known, deep down, that Sarah hadn't told him everything. But now, hearing her voice tremble with emotion, he realized just how much she had been carrying alone. "I never fought for answers," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "After they told me the baby was gone, I didn't ask questions. I was so heartbroken, so devastated, that I just accepted it. I didn't demand to see the body. I didn't ask for any proof. I just believed what they told me." David's chest tightened as he listened. He knew that pain all too well, the feeling of being so consumed by grief that you couldn't even think straight, let alone fight for clarity. But hearing it from Sarah, knowing that her story mirrored his own so closely, stirred something deep within him. "You were grieving," David said gently. "You did what anyone would have done." Sarah shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "No, I should have pushed harder. I should have known something wasn't right, but I didn't want to believe that there could be more. I was too scared of the truth." Her voice broke, and she wiped at her eyes, her hands trembling. "I've been running ever since, trying to escape that guilt. But no matter how far I go, it's always there. And now, knowing what we know, it's eating me alive. What if I had done more? What if I could have saved my child?" David's heart clenched. He stood up and moved to her side, sitting beside her and placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, you can't blame yourself for this. You were lied to, just like I was. We both were. None of this is your fault." She shook her head again, unable to meet his eyes. But I should have tried harder. I should have fought for my baby. David's voice softened, but his resolve was firm. And now you are. We both are. We're fighting for the truth, for our children. That's all we can do. Sarah finally looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. I'm scared, David, she whispered. What if it's too late? What if we never find them? David's stomach twisted at the thought. The fear of what they might uncover, or worse, what they might not uncover, was a constant weight on his chest. But he couldn't let that fear control him. He couldn't let it stop him from doing everything in his power to find the truth. We'll find them, he said, his voice strong and certain, even though inside, he was just as afraid. We have to. Sarah nodded, though her expression remained haunted. She leaned into David's side, resting her head on his shoulder as the rain continued to fall outside. They sat like that for a long time, the weight of their shared pain hanging between them like a heavy fog. But in that silence, a small spark of hope remained, a fragile but undeniable connection that kept them moving forward. The following day brought no new developments. David paced the mansion's large living room, unable to sit still, while Sarah remained quiet, lost in her own thoughts. Every few hours, David checked his phone, waiting for updates from Henry or Richard, but nothing came. The anticipation was suffocating. Then, finally, just as dusk began to settle over the city, David's phone buzzed. He snatched it off the table, his heart racing as he answered. David, it's Henry. I've got something. David's breath caught in his throat. What did you find? I dug deeper into the Winston Clinic records. There's a paper trail, like I suspected, but it's messy. Lots of redacted files, names that have been scrubbed. But I found one thing that stood out. There's a connection between the clinic and a private adoption agency, one that was notorious for handling off-the-books adoptions. David's blood ran cold. What's the name of the agency? The Crown Adoption Network, Henry said. It operated under the radar for years before shutting down abruptly. But before it did, there were several transactions linked to children who were supposedly deceased. The dates matched the timeline of when your baby and Sarah's would have been born. David's mind raced. The Crown Adoption Network. He had never heard of it before, but if it was connected to the clinic, then this was the lead they needed. Can you track down the people who ran it? David asked, his voice urgent. I'm working on it, Henry replied. But it won't be easy. These people know how to cover their tracks. They've been doing it for years. David clenched his fist, frustration and determination battling within him. Do whatever it takes. We need to find them. After hanging up, David relayed the information to Sarah, who sat across from him, listening intently. The Crown Adoption Network. It was the first real lead they had, but with it came even more questions. How many families had been lied to? How many lives had been destroyed by this network of corruption? We're getting closer, David said, though the words felt hollow. He wanted to believe it, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. They were chasing shadows, and every step they took seemed to lead to more darkness. Sarah nodded, but her eyes were distant. I don't understand how something like this could happen. How could so many people have been involved? David didn't have an answer. The more they uncovered, the more sinister the truth seemed. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about an entire system built on lies and stolen lives. That night, as they sat by the fire, the weight of the day's revelations pressed heavily on them both. David stared into the flames, his mind still racing, while Sarah sat quietly, lost in her own thoughts. The silence between them was thick with unspoken fears, the gravity of what they were facing looming ever larger. I can't stop thinking about what comes next, Sarah whispered suddenly, breaking the quiet. Her voice was shaky, filled with a vulnerability David hadn't seen before. What if we find out they're gone, David? What if all of this leads to more heartbreak? David turned to her, seeing the fear in her eyes, and it mirrored the same fear that gripped his own heart. I don't know what we'll find, Sarah, he admitted, his voice low. But we can't stop now. We owe it to them, to our children, to find out the truth. She nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. I know, but it's hard not to be scared. David reached out, taking her hand in his. I'm scared too, he confessed. But we're in this together. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Sarah squeezed his hand, a tear slipping down her cheek. They had come so far, but the road ahead was still shrouded in uncertainty. Yet, despite the fear, despite the unknown, there was a quiet strength between them, a determination to see this through to the end. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and no matter what it cost them, they were going to find it. The following days passed in a blur of restless anticipation. David and Sarah were caught in a limbo, their emotions torn between hope and fear as they waited for Henry and Richard to uncover more about the Crown Adoption Network. The mansion felt like a prison, the walls closing in as the weight of the unknown pressed down on them. The silence between them was no longer filled with the quiet comfort it once had been. It was thick with tension, both of them haunted by the terrifying question: what if they never found their children? Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David's phone rang. It was Henry. "We've got something," Henry said, his voice urgent. David's heart lurched in his chest. "What is it?" "I traced one of the names from the Crown Adoption Network. A woman named Evelyn Royce. She was the administrator who handled most of the high-profile cases at the clinic, including yours and Sarah's." David's grip tightened around the phone. "Where is she now?" "Upstate," Henry replied. "A small town called Briarwood. She's been living under the radar for years, but she's still there. If anyone knows what happened to your children, it's her." David's pulse quickened. This was it, the lead they had been waiting for. "I'm going there tonight." "Be careful, David," Henry warned. "She's been in hiding for a reason. If she gets spooked, she could disappear before you get anything out of her." David hung up and immediately told Sarah what Henry had found. Her reaction was a mix of hope and fear. "What if she knows where our children are?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What if this is it?" David's eyes were steady, though inside, his own emotions were a storm. There's only one way to find out. They wasted no time. Within the hour, David and Sarah were in his car, speeding toward Briarwood, a sense of urgency gripping them both. The night stretched ahead of them, the highway slick with rain. Sarah was silent beside him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, staring out the window as the miles flew by. David's mind raced. This was their first real lead, someone who had been directly involved in the clinic's dark operations. Evelyn Royce. The name felt like a lifeline, a tether to the truth they had been searching for. But with that hope came fear. What if she refused to talk? What if she was part of something bigger, something they couldn't fight? By the time they reached Briarwood, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, casting a dreary mist over the small town. It was quiet, almost eerily so, as David pulled up to the address Henry had provided. The house was unassuming, nestled among tall trees at the edge of town. It didn't look like the home of someone hiding a dark secret, but David had learned not to trust appearances long ago. Sarah glanced at David, her face pale in the dim light of the dashboard. "Are we really doing this?" David nodded, his jaw set. "We have to." They stepped out into the cold night air, the tension between them palpable. As they approached the house, David could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the stillness. A long moment passed before the door creaked open, revealing an older woman. Her face was lined with age, but her sharp eyes took them both in with a wariness that sent a shiver down David's spine. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady but guarded. David stepped forward, his tone firm but measured. "We're here to talk about the Winston Clinic, about the Crown Adoption Network." Evelyn's face tightened, her eyes narrowing. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Please," Sarah interjected, her voice filled with desperation. "We know who you are. We know you were involved. We just want to know the truth. What happened to our children?" Evelyn's eyes flicked to Sarah, something like recognition flashing in them, but she quickly masked it. "You need to leave," she said coldly, beginning to close the door. David reacted quickly, stepping forward to block the door from shutting. His voice was calm but unyielding. "We're not leaving until you tell us what you know. We've been searching for years. Our children, both of them, were taken from us. We were told they were dead, but we know that's not true." Evelyn's hand faltered on the door, her expression shifting. For a moment, it looked like she might still slam the door in their faces, but then something broke in her resolve. She sighed heavily, stepping back to let them in. Inside, the house was dimly lit, filled with old furniture and the smell of dust. Evelyn gestured for them to sit, but David and Sarah remained standing, the tension in the room too thick to allow them to relax. Evelyn sat down heavily in a worn armchair, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I knew this day would come," she said quietly, her voice weary. "I've been waiting for it." David's heart raced. "Then you know why we're here." She nodded slowly, her hands wringing in her lap. "I worked for the Winston Clinic, yes. I handled certain cases like yours." Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling. "What happened to our babies?" Evelyn looked up at them, her expression filled with something close to regret. "The clinic was involved in illegal adoptions. We told families their children were dead, but in reality, those babies were sent to wealthy couples who were desperate to adopt. It was all about money. A baby who was supposedly deceased could be sold for a fortune." Sarah let out a choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth as the truth hit her like a tidal wave. David felt the ground shift beneath him, his mind struggling to process the enormity of what Evelyn was saying. "You took our children," David said, his voice low with barely contained anger. "You lied to us." "I didn't take them," Evelyn whispered, her eyes filled with guilt. "I was just a cog in the machine, but I helped facilitate it. And for that, I'm sorry." "Sorry?" Sarah's voice broke. "Our children are gone because of you." Evelyn flinched, but she didn't deny it. "I know," she whispered. "I know." David's fists clenched at his sides, his fury barely contained. But anger wasn't going to help them now. They needed answers. "Where are they?" he demanded, his voice tight. "Where are our children?" Evelyn hesitated, her face etched with fear and regret. "I don't know exactly. I swear, I don't." Once the babies were handed over, they disappeared into the system. "But," she trailed off, her eyes flicking to David. "But what?" David snapped. Evelyn swallowed hard. "I remember your case," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The adoption, it didn't go through like the others. There was something wrong with the paperwork, something that delayed the process. Your baby, your son, he was placed in foster care instead of being sold." David's heart stopped. "Foster care? Where?" "I don't know," Evelyn admitted, tears brimming in her eyes. "But there's a record, a file. I can help you find it." David's mind raced. His son, his child, could still be out there, alive, waiting. Sarah's child, too. "And Sarah's baby?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Evelyn looked at Sarah, her expression pained. "I don't have the records for her case, but I can help you find them. There's a network, people who know where these children were placed. I can get you in touch with them." For a moment, no one spoke. The gravity of what Evelyn had revealed hung in the air like a heavy fog. David and Sarah had spent years grieving children they thought were dead, and now, in the span of a few minutes, everything had changed. Their children were alive, but finding them would be the hardest part yet. David looked at Sarah, her tear-streaked face mirroring the same mix of hope and fear that churned inside him. They were on the edge of something monumental, but the path ahead was treacherous. "We'll find them," David said softly, his voice filled with determination. "We'll find them." The days following their conversation with Evelyn felt like a blur. David and Sarah had been consumed by a mix of hope and dread, anxiously awaiting the next call that might change everything. And then it came. "I found him," Richard had said. David's heart stopped. His son, alive. His name was Matthew, and he had been living with a foster family in upstate New York. David couldn't breathe. After years of believing his child was gone, this was the moment he had hoped for but never truly expected. David and Sarah prepared quickly, their emotions barely contained. While they still hadn't found Sarah's child, she pushed David forward, urging him to meet Matthew. "Go," she had said. "We'll find my baby, but this is your moment." The drive upstate felt like a dream. When David arrived at the modest house, his nerves were frayed. But as the door opened and he laid eyes on Matthew for the first time, the world seemed to slow. The boy, his boy, stood there, curious but calm. "Hi," Matthew said shyly, glancing up at David with innocent eyes. He had no idea who David was. David knelt, tears threatening to break through. "Hi, Matthew. It's so good to meet you." They spent the afternoon together, the foster parents kind and open, describing Matthew's life, his hobbies, his bright, curious nature. Every word felt like a piece of the life David had missed. He listened, feeling both joy and grief. Joy for this reunion, grief for the lost years. By the time the day ended, David felt a connection he couldn't put into words. He promised Matthew he'd return soon, and when he hugged his son for the first time, it felt like a piece of his broken heart had finally been restored. When David returned home, Sarah was waiting by the fire. She looked up as he entered, her face filled with hope and quiet sadness. "How was it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David sat beside her, taking her hand. "He's incredible, Sarah. He's everything I imagined." Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled. "I'm so happy for you." David squeezed her hand tighter. "We'll find your child. I promise you." Sarah nodded, and they sat together in silence, knowing their journey wasn't over. David had found his son, and now the search for Sarah's child continued. But in that moment, they shared something deeper: hope. The truth had brought them here, and together, they would face whatever came next.